Just quickly to comment on what Micah said about our involvement. I'm in the university system of Georgia, which Georgia's a state that's twice the size of Ireland and has been intimately connected with the Kennedy story and civil rights. And I'm going to highlight an aspect of that. As you all know, Martin Luther King was from Atlanta, Georgia. And we bring every year 60 students to Waterford Institute of Technology for a 5-week full credit program. And I'm proud to say that of all University System of Georgia programs in Europe over the last 2 years, our program here at WIT was ranked #1. We're up against programs in Paris, London, Madrid, and so forth. And I think a great deal of that goes to the credit of WIT for their phenomenal support of our program and the extraordinary world-class facilities that they have down there in Waterford. And like my own university in Savannah area, WIT is a regional university. I'm using that word, Minister, you notice that word I used, university. And really holds its own. I mean, its reputation precedes it, at least in our state. And we bring our students all over this region. We actually call our program the Waterford Ireland program, and our students travel 2 days of every week to venues like Dunbrody. We bring our students every year to New Ross, and they spend a morning in New Ross and see Sean's phenomenal facility here and do the tour. And it's emotional for our students, particularly when they see that clip of Kennedy before they go onto the ship. So we were talking about tourism and the relationship, direct relationship between the Southeast and the United States. But we are a concrete example of that every year, bringing students and indeed researchers to this region. So I'm going to talk today about John F. Kennedy in particular, but also mention Robert Kennedy because the two go together, as we've all known. It's just a great pleasure to have Bobby here. And I have some letters that your grandfather wrote on one of these slides here. So we all have a basic understanding of the relationship between John F. Kennedy and civil rights. What I want to do today is just dig down one layer deeper and maybe share a story that you don't know. But it's an extraordinarily important story. It adds a certain complexity to our understanding of what the Kennedy brothers faced in advancing civil rights. And it concerns a Georgian. In fact, this man about whom I'm going to speak this morning is probably the most important Georgian of the 20th century. And that's what Jimmy Carter says about him. And his name is Richard Brevard Russell. And the photograph on this slide is obviously of Kennedy and Russell together. They're actually at a military review in this case. So my talk is going to explore that relationship with respect to civil rights, and the subtitle of the talk is Lessons for Ireland. When contemplating John Fitzgerald Kennedy and civil rights, as this panel seeks to do, it's instructive to consider a name that nowadays certainly is less than familiar in many quarters. The name belongs to the so-called general of the United States Senate's White Southern Bloc, or caucus, from the late 1940s until beyond President Lyndon B. Johnson's Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, whose effect was making real the 15th Amendment of 1870. Senators from the former Confederacy, all white and all male, generated the moniker the General, not least to acknowledge this individual's encyclopedic grasp of Senate rules and precedents and his clout on key committees. Although, or perhaps because, he refused to head up a Democratic Party splinter, the Dixiecrats, to oppose Truman in the 1948 presidential election, he came to dominate not just the Southern program in the Senate, but often the entire chamber. To put the above in slightly different terms, when President Kennedy was shaping and pushing forward civil rights legislation, he needed to, he could not but negotiate with the man I've in mind, a political colossus, the Senate's supreme parliamentarian, the arch defender of a traditional notion of the white Southland. His name is Richard Brevard Russell, Jr., or simply Dick Russell, Democrat of Georgia. And my talk hopes to explore in clear, useful terms the Kennedy-Russell dynamic around the issue of civil rights. In particular, what lessons that dynamic may offer Ireland, now 14 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, with its provisions for parity of esteem. It's easy and tempting to disparage Russell as a bigot who anachronistically sought to block the long overdue disassembly of Jim Crow apartheid in the American South. Yet the situation was more complicated, and it is within those complications that some lessons for present-day Ireland may perhaps be found. But I get ahead of myself. Let's begin with a capsule biography of Russell. He was born into an Irish-sounding situation, a rural family with big political ambitions. We know those kind of families in Ireland. His father ran unsuccessfully for both governor of Georgia and U.S. senator from Georgia before becoming Chief Justice of the state's Supreme Court. The son, there was no pressure there, the son followed a middling academic career. He wasn't a great scholar. He did graduate law school at the University of Georgia, but he followed his academic path with a winning campaign for a seat in the Georgia State House. Aged only 22 and soliciting votes, Dick Russell declared, quote, "I will appreciate the support and influence of every white voter, and if elected, I pledge to serve you all acceptably." This is an important statement because it identifies his constituency, every white voter, and his sense of duty to serve you all. Matters that remained lodestars all his subsequent days. In 1927, his 29th year, Russell was elected Speaker of the Georgia House. 4 years later, he became the youngest governor in modern Peach State history, an incumbency that would be distinguished by the eradication of state indebtedness through the rationalization of agencies. It was Governor Russell who created the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia, which is my employer. At age 34, just think about that, with 58% of the vote, he won election as Georgia's junior United States Senator. Decades later, J. William Bill Fulbright, senator from Arkansas, would reflect, quote, "If ever there was anyone who gave his life to an institution, I would say Russell gave it to the Senate." Or to quote Senator Robert C. Byrd of West Virginia speaking in 2002, "Senator Russell never married, but he had a bride, the United States Senate." Upon entering the Senate, Russell manipulated the then current state of affairs to attain a seat on the Appropriations Committee, an all but unheard of appointment for a freshman. More than today, senatorial power in the mid-20th century derived from committee positions, especially status as a chair. And over his uninterrupted 38 years under the Capitol Dome, Russell became particularly associated with the Appropriations Committee, its Agricultural Subcommittee, and the Armed Services Committee. With the exception of a couple of years in the mid-1950s, he chaired armed services from 1951 until 1969, service that encompassed the Kennedy administration. Russell had many and varied strings to his bow. His worldview incorporated not an agendum, but multiple agenda, a fact worth bearing in mind, even or especially when assessing his dealings with Kennedy on civil rights. Too many current American politicians don ideological straitjackets, as if one stance, pro-gun, for example, necessitates certain others, right to life, Medicare vouchers, etc. You know the drill. We've seen Mr. Romney get in line. Given his civil rights creed, innate white superiority, separate public accommodations, a commercial property owner's prerogative to determine who to serve, and states' rights, rights some Russell critics held that often trumped an individual's rights. Given this creed, one might predict a thoroughly conservative Russell. However, both the family that helped shape him and the career he crafted had significant progressive dimensions. The press branded his father a, quote, socialist for advocating state assistance to those whose finances made a college education hard or impossible. And I was interested to see Condoleezza Rice at the Republican convention describe education as the civil rights issue of our day. So Russell's father was ahead of the curve on education. And when a United States Senator, Dick Russell supported with enthusiasm much of FDR's New Deal. Indeed, a personal point of pride was his 1946 guidance of the school lunch program through the Senate, a still extant piece of legislation signed by President Truman that's perhaps more beneficial to blacks than whites. So the school lunch program in the United States, its official name is the Richard B. Russell School Lunch Program to this day. He was a very modest man, but that was the one piece of legislation that he wanted his name on. Yes, many excoriated his stubborn defense of the inhumane and disenfranchising race-based dispensation, which cracked on the 26th of July 1948, when Truman desegregated the US military, and cracked some more on the 5th of June 1950, when the Supreme Court delivered several anti-discrimination rulings that would prove critical to the Brown versus Board of Education decision 4 years later. However, having battled and thoroughly beaten Russell on civil rights, his legislative peers continued to recognize his bigness, his multifacetedness, his integrity, his patriotism. A measure of Russell is that in 1972, just 1 year after he died, only one objection was heard in a Senate voice vote on a motion to rename the principal Senate office building after him, the building in which Jack Kennedy had his suite and from which he announced his presidential candidacy. In Ireland, with our many well-oiled, rights-related binaries, Republican, Unionist, pro-treaty, anti-treaty, and so forth, it's perhaps smart to honor all that is worthy in the other, and not reduce him to a single issue, in some cases, his willful blind spot. Richard Brevard Russell, Jr., or RBR, met JFK on double terms. First, the Georgian acknowledged the Irish-American's specialness as a warrior, intellectual, and orator. Second, he scrutinized how Kennedy and his people used Russell's protege, Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas. Protege, you ask? Absolutely. In one letter, Johnson called Russell the closest friend I have, part of every decision I have made. After Dallas, obliging Russell to serve on the Warren Commission, he insisted, quote, "You made me, and I know it." As majority leader during Kennedy's debut Senate term, Johnson had gotten President Eisenhower's 1957 Civil Rights Act through the chamber on a 60-15 vote. Essentially, the act was a weak voting rights provision amended into that status by Johnson to placate Russell and by Russell himself. In fact, the liberal Republican Senator Jacob K. Javits of New York called it, quote, "a victory for the Old South." So there you go, that was the first big piece of civil rights legislation, 1957, and it was described by the Republicans as a victory, not for African Americans, but for the Old South. Russell actually voted with the nays, but he didn't engineer a Southern Bloc filibuster, partly perhaps to position Johnson for a potential presidential run. Dated the 9th of September, 1957, 55 years ago this Sunday, only 55 years ago, the act represented progress of a sort, the first post-Reconstruction success for civil rights legislation. However, a problem quickly problematized it. Just a few days later, in an attempt to honor the Supreme Court's Brown school desegregation ruling, Eisenhower deployed federal troops at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Russell deemed the deed, quote, "totalitarian rule, executive overreach in support of an activist judiciary." Arguably, these two all but coincidental matters, the Act's passage and then Little Rock, are enlightening to us in Ireland in that they underscore how an apparently inerrant principle, civil rights, can, in the real world, play out variously. In a manifestly changing nation, Russell was prepared to tolerate voting rights, but not integration. And he was okay with a mild legislative response, but hostile towards what he saw as absolutist presidential and court action. The two matters also remind us that an unexpected event. Very few people thought that the Arkansas governor, Orville Faubus, would attempt to bar black students from Central High. So a surprise event, something out of left field, can re-energize quickly traditional animosities and thus scuttle reformist gains. The November 1958 election gave Jack Kennedy his second term, in which he beheld Russell coordinate 3 teams of Southern senators to organize a civil rights filibuster against a second bill. That's how Russell rolled in the Senate. He would divide his troops into 3 camps and basically have them on duty round the clock to filibuster. And undoubtedly that was a learning experience in parliamentary maneuvering for the Massachusetts lawmaker. Russell's tactics caused the bill's sponsors to attenuate it into virtual toothlessness, and Eisenhower signed the measure into law in May 1960, 12 months before the first Freedom Riders hit the road for Dixie. So in other words, we have 2 civil rights bills pass before Kennedy becomes president, and that's something we should bear in mind, but they were both extremely weak. Russell, later in 1960, endorsed Johnston's too-late bid for the Democratic presidential nomination, going on to express disappointment when Johnson accepted Kennedy's running mate offer. This is the slide, Bobby, that your grandfather sent to Dick Russell. He's soliciting Russell's help in the Kennedy campaign. This is, as you can see, letterhead, U.S. Senator John F. Kennedy for president. And he's giving, in this particular letter, just a little extract of it there, I don't expect you to be able to read that from this distance, but he's asking Russell to support Kennedy's campaign, and he's giving Russell some talking points on Kennedy's Catholic faith, what to talk about if he was asked questions about Kennedy's Catholic faith. Without Johnson, I think this next bit of the talk is really a fascinating element of the Kennedy story. Without Johnson on the ticket, Kennedy would have lost critical southern states, and he would have lost the election, which was very, very tight. However, in New Ross this morning, we should pause to wonder whether determinative in the South that autumn was Russell's abandonment of his reservations in order to do 11th hour on-the-ground campaigning on behalf of the JFK LBJ team, chiefly in Texas. Arguably, Russell put not just the Lone Star State, but also Georgia and South Carolina over the line for the Democratic headliners. Absent Richard Brevard Russell, we might not have had a President John Kennedy, at least not in the early 1960s. A Presbyterian who for a spell was engaged to an Irish-American Catholic, Russell would time and again butt heads with Kennedy. According to the historian John Goldsmith, Lyndon Johnson used a low gerund beginning with SH to characterize Russell's rage when the president-elect proposed Robert Kennedy for Attorney General. Russell is SHing a squealing word, Johnson said. In a note I discovered, dated 15th of December 1960, Orbial records JFK's telling him of his own volition that, quote, he did not feel that he should appoint his brother to the post. He stated, Russell writes, he did not feel he should, he stated, Russell writes, that he knew there would be a great deal of litigation involving racial relations, and that he did not feel he wanted the name Kennedy to become a curse word in the southern states. Their differences notwithstanding, the post-inauguration Kennedy consulted with Russell regularly and respectfully. One thinks immediately of huge national security issues. Russell was a hawk on Cuba, but not on Vietnam. He advised Kennedy not to go near Vietnam. In addition, the fundamentally urban or suburban Kennedy often went to Russell first on agricultural policy and rural life. And we should remember that in the 1960s, rural America was much of America. Russell's consciousness of farm poverty ranged across the races. In 1963, he commented, quote, we must attack rural economic disadvantage on a broader front than the racial front. It isn't confined to the Negro race. The dominant tone of the Kennedy-Russell relationship may be judged from a letter beginning, Dear Dick, that President Kennedy sent on the 18th of July, 1962. I'm having this delivered by hand, Kennedy wrote. I would be pleased to talk to you on the telephone. I would be most grateful for your personal and confidential guidance. Indeed, Kennedy designated Russell to represent him at the Tomb of the Unknowns for the 1961 Memorial Day commemoration. An honor that I highly prize, Russell told the Commander-in-Chief. Displaying warmth and candor when eulogizing the assassinated Kennedy in the Senate, Russell would aver he was a man of tolerance and understanding. He fought hard for those things in which he believed, but he well knew that all men would not see the same issue in the same light. During the Kennedy administration, which television mass communication confirmed as the age of freedom riders and of another gifted Georgian, Martin Luther King, more and more of his fellow Americans, indeed of his fellow Southerners, were failing to see civil rights in the same light as Russell. Here we remark upon a lesson or reminder for Ireland, and this is what John Bowman touched on very much in his talk yesterday morning, the capacity of new media to create and empower mass constituencies. The Southern Senators' committee-based clout on Capitol Hill had long insulated them from popular national opinion. However, by the late 1950s, not only had TV ownership increased to around 92% of American households, but networks were reimagining news coverage, adding more and more national stories. Emblematic of the sweeping, even revolutionary TV tide that Russell couldn't repel were images of police Alsatians and fire department hoses literally flooring black civil rights protesters, many of them children and teenagers, in Birmingham, Alabama, during a spell beginning on the 3rd of May, 1963, a response to Martin Luther King's Project C, or Project Confrontation campaign. The master rhetorician Kennedy could and did listen to the verbally persuasive Russell argue about Jeffersonian precepts of states' rights with the television and indeed the print images of Police Chief Bull Connor's forces. And those are the images we're looking at right now. Those forces, those images, also delivered a message. Delivered it unambiguously and internationally. The truth about civil rights, Kennedy said, was, quote, so much more eloquently reported by the Birmingham news camera than by any number of explanatory words. On the 19th of June, 1963, exactly 1 week before he landed in Ireland on this momentous visit that we're celebrating, Kennedy sent his major civil rights bill to Congress. So when he was speaking in New Ross, that was the thing he had just done back home. Birmingham made all the difference because it got the Kennedy civil rights strategy out of the White House and onto the Hill in earnest. Conscious of a potentially tough second-term race, and more importantly, reluctant to excite Russell, the Georgia giant, and his filibuster machine, JFK had theretofore addressed civil rights primarily through executive orders and his brother Bobby's Justice Department. Frustrated, even incredulous, in January 1962, a full year into the Kennedy administration, New York's Jack Javits highlighted from the Senate floor Kennedy's, quote, calculated policy of avoiding the Congress on civil rights. 4 months later, the administration failed to overcome Russell's tactics against a small fry civil rights bill concerning literacy tests at polling places. And for its part, a voting rights bill that the President presented to Congress in late February 1963, 9 weeks before Birmingham erupted, was tame, not worth going for, according to the white civil rights lawyer Joseph Rao. Kennedy accompanied that bill with a special message identifying action points for further reform. But even then, he was not especially bold, admitting, quote, the various steps which have been undertaken or which are proposed in this message do not constitute a final answer to the problems of race discrimination in this country. So in other words, Kennedy had sent, just to sort of recap that, Kennedy had sent 2 civil rights bills up to the Congress before he sent his really big one, the one that he sent just before coming to New Ross. And he was under a lot of pressure, particularly from Republicans, about just not doing enough on civil rights in the Congress. Rather like the Para's disproportionate actions on Bloody Sunday, Bull Connor's unwarranted brutality in Birmingham required answer. Boldly, against the advice of many administration strategists, the two older Kennedy brothers forsook concerns about losing the 1964 election and about tying up Congress with extended debate, which was Richard Russell's preferred term for the filibuster. Working in tandem, the White House and the Justice Department built the bill that would travel up Pennsylvania Avenue just prior to the President's County Wexford trip. With care and astuteness, Bobby Kennedy crafted clauses to specify the extent and limits of his Justice Department's investigative and prosecutorial reach, while Jack insisted on strong public accommodations language that would prove to be Russell's greatest problem with the proposal. And that, I think, is an interesting insight into Jack Kennedy and civil rights. The thing that he was most passionate about in crafting that big piece of legislation was public accommodations, that blacks and whites had equal restaurants to buses, restaurants, and so forth. Vice President Johnson urged sending a reasonably complete draft of the legislation to Russell for review to, quote, let him advance every argument he can. And indeed, both President Kennedy and Attorney General Kennedy consulted with Russell during the writing process, meaning that the Georgian couldn't later make a claim of having been sidelined. Russell was ideologically unmovable, however, prompting JFK to tell a journalist that, quote, no one puzzles me more than Senator Russell. A man of great gifts, who remains adamant and defiant respecting civil rights. The legislative effort was duly engaged, with JFK relying not just on the Senate's Democratic Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield of Montana, we see him here, and also the Republican Senate Minority Leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois. So Kennedy made a bipartisan effort to get this legislation through. However, everything stopped suddenly on the 22nd of November, 1963. A day that saw Russell unable to control his tears before the press. And that saw Lyndon Johnson ask for Russell's help as soon as Air Force One landed in Washington from Dallas, carrying two presidents. So in other words, as Johnson got off the plane, having come back with the body that day, the first person he asked for as he put his foot on the tarmac was Richard Russell. After Kennedy's passing, President Johnson committed to civil rights as a Kennedy legacy issue. Embarking on the mammoth task, Johnson put his great mentor, Russell, on notice. Quote, Dick, I love you. I owe you. But I'm going to run over you if you challenge me or get in my way. I aim to pass this civil rights bill. Only this time, Dick, there will be no cavilling, no compromise, no falling back. This bill is going to pass. Oops, I went a little too far. There we go. Johnson beefed up Kennedy's proposal by, among other things, adding fair employment language. And despite a Russell-led filibuster that by some reckonings consumed 74 days during the spring and early summer of 1964, the bill passed, receiving Johnson's signature on television 2 days before Independence Day. During the debate, Russell criticized Bobby Kennedy for supplying Congress with legal opinions about the bill, an overstepping of constitutional bounds, according to the Georgian. But ultimately, he managed to secure only 29 of the senators needed to prevent cloture. The debate guillotine, which was famously used by Gladstone against Irish obstructionism in the late 1880s. Conversing with Orville L. Freeman, the Minnesota senator who had nominated Kennedy for the presidency at the 1960 Democratic Convention. Russell opined, quote, "We could have beaten John Kennedy on civil rights, but not Lyndon Johnson." For Russell, who would turn 67 in late 1964, a new episteme had begun, just as the Good Friday Agreement made a new episteme in our island of Ireland, guaranteeing, quote, "full respect for and equality of civil, political, social, and cultural rights, and freedom from discrimination for all citizens." The civil rights campaign that Russell resisted was one impetus for the Northern Irish movement of the 1960s onward, a genuinely historic effort associated not least with Austin Currie, with whom it's an honor to share this stage. The Irish Catholics and Protestants such as Ivan Cooper and Edwina Stewart, who took up the cause then in Dungannon, the Bogside and elsewhere, encountered in many Unionists much the same kind of civilizational anxiety that animated Russell. In both cases, the anxiety had a past, but importantly, one within living memory. The Unionists of the 1960s and 70s weren't far away in time from those of the 19-teens, when the Home Rule crisis peaked. Similarly, Dick Russell, in the middle of the 20th century, was still close to his people's darkest hour, the impoverished, protracted season of Reconstruction, when federal authorities imposed their will on defeated and thus marginalized white Southerners. We've got a lot of history students. I was talking to some of the students from the college here before I got on the stage. We've got a lot of history students here. A little later this month, the 28th of September, is the centenary of Ulster Day, when Unionist men in their hundreds of thousands signed the Ulster Covenant, which characterizes as, quote, "subversive of our civil and religious freedom and destructive of our citizenship, British government desire to, quote, force home rule upon us." Famously, Rudyard Kipling's poem, Ulster 1912, sees Westminster as the actor when it laments, "Our honor, lives, and land are given for reward to folly, sloth, and spite, and we are thrust away." It is no stretch to claim that were the backdrop Atlanta, not Stormont, Kipling could have been ventriloquizing Russell, who feared what he called the mongrelization of white blood and culture, believing whites to have less folly, sloth, and spite than blacks, albeit that Georgia had for centuries denied blacks a serious education, an antidote to folly, stimulating work, a defense against sloth, and satisfying rewards, a remedy for spite. Kennedy, in sending his civil rights bill up to the Congress, made an extraordinary speech, and this image is of him delivering that speech on television to the nation, directing it specifically at the Congress. Around a month later, in an extended CBS television interview, the master lawmaker Russell echoed some of the president's points. "I am well aware that we're living in a social revolution," he said, going on to acknowledge the fact of, quote, "what we all admit are social injustices and economic injustices affecting blacks. I think it's gotten somewhat out of hand," he said of the reform drive, and he highlighted Kennedy in particular. "I know the president didn't realize what was developing here, but it could well be that he has turned the genie out of the bottle now." In these reflections, we sense a cautious man, but one without his head buried in the sand. We also sense a man who is wholly conscious of and truly affected by Kennedy, the resolute, reach for the moon magus of the new generation of Americans. As much as anything, this matter may be JFK's greatest impact on ORBR vis-a-vis civil rights, not his ability to finish the job. Recall Russell's comment, "We could have beaten John Kennedy," but rather to take the job already begun and make it properly big. Lyndon Johnson did not make civil rights properly big in 57 or in 60, and that leaves one to speculate whether he would have if by some unlikely chance he'd have won the president nomination and then the general election in 1960. In fine, despite a slow start, Kennedy amplified the discourse on civil rights, crucially so. Kennedy's civil rights bill was not as wide-ranging as the one Lyndon Johnson built upon it, but it was sufficiently big, and what it presaged was so big that Russell labeled it a monstrosity. These are a few concluding comments. Deploying many of the same statistics on black disadvantage in education, employment, and life expectancy that had featured in Kennedy's second 1960 debate with Nixon, the 1963 Oval Office Civil Rights Talk, this one that the image reflects, demanded new laws at every level. One of the laws that ensued, fewer, indeed perhaps none was more congruent with Kennedy's design than the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which in many ways marked curtains for Russell's fight. Remember that King always called voting rights or suffrage the central front on civil rights. Addressing the Congress and such guests as MLK at the Act's 6th of August signing ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda, Johnson included words intended for the Southern Bloc, especially Dick Russell, who'd been very ill much of that year. "I know how difficult it can be," the president stated, "to bend long years of habit and custom to grant freedom." He elaborated, "There is no room for injustice anywhere in the American mansion, but there is always room for understanding towards those who see the old ways crumbling. And to them today, I simply say this: freedom must come. And when it has, you will find a burden lifted off your shoulders too." One speculates that Johnson's use of the word burden may derive from Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. But by contrast with many in the white Southern camp when under threat, Russell did not indulge in the demagoguery that on occasion Kipling was wont to display, parts of Ulster 1912 that I didn't invoke earlier being a case in point. And this brings me to this final major point about what Russell's response to Kennedy's civil rights vision may teach us Irish. Often called the Lion of the Senate, as Ted Kennedy would later be, Richard Russell was a racist who made defense of Southern segregation a central plank of his far-reaching and remarkable political career. To his abiding credit, however, he eschewed the firebrand, rabble-rousing language of denigration and insult deployed by many white civil rights opponents, even in the Senate. Not least, indeed, Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi. Popularly called the Bilbonic Plague, that individual warned the Senate about black rape of, quote, the sweethearts of Dixie. Russell may have denounced Kennedy's civil rights platform as, quote, special privileges to a small group at the expense of the white people of the South. But at base, he was paternalistic and patronizing, not embittered and hateful towards African Americans. Furthermore, within days of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Russell did something that in response to the Good Friday Agreement, the majority of Irish people also did. Accept the document as legitimately formative of the nation. Not the nation as traditionally conceived, but the nation now. Speaking in Rome, a city in northwest Georgia, on the 15th of July, speaking in full knowledge that his words would receive national attention, Russell declared, quote, "It is the understatement of the year to say that I do not like these statutes. However, they are now in the books, and it becomes our duty as good citizens to learn to live with them. The strange doctrine that a citizen may pick and choose the laws he will obey and ignore, those he does not like, is to me totally reprehensible, a form of anarchy. It is therefore our duty as good and patriotic citizens in a period that will undoubtedly be marked by tension and unrest to avoid all violence." It is important to stress that among major Southern politicians, Russell was alone in articulating this stance. On this island, in our lifetimes, we have been fortunate to have had leaders who sooner or later adjusted with grace to the new civil rights and constitutional regimes. And to those individuals, I humbly proffer as cheer Lyndon Johnson's response to Russell's remarks. Identifying his longtime friend as, quote, "the acknowledged leader of the opposition to civil rights," the president wrote, "Dear Dick, the statement you made on the need to comply with the law was as significant as any I have heard made by a public official. It was the right and courageous thing to do, and I am as proud and pleased as I can be." In part, it must have been Russell's quality of patriotic high-mindedness, manifest in Rome, but manifest too across earlier decades, that caused Jack Kennedy to advise his brother Ted when making courtesy calls as a freshman senator in January 1963 to convey to Russell that despite their differences over civil rights, there was, and here I'm going to quote Ted Kennedy, "no one in the Senate for whom the president had greater respect." For his part, Russell genuinely admired the Kennedy family. In doing research interviews, more than one person told me that it was he who suggested to JFK that the president try a Brumby rocking chair for his back pain. So Kennedy's use of that rocking chair was thanks to Russell, apparently. Russell's work notes include the following, apropos a wide-ranging one-on-one meeting early in 1963, a meeting that touched on civil rights. Quote, "I told President Kennedy that it was a good thing that America had a young, strong man to bear all of its burdens. And I hoped and prayed that they would be satisfactorily solved." Particularly touching and appropriate, in my opinion, was Russell's words to Jacqueline Kennedy 4 days after the assassination. Quote, "Only a great lady in the finest traditions of the old school could have displayed such magnificent courage." On day one of Edward Kennedy's Senate career, the venerable Russell advised him, "You go further if you go slow." However, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who we're remembering, assessing, and celebrating in New Ross this week, was not in the end prepared to go slow on the civil rights front. The entrenched Senate power of Russell and his bloc notwithstanding. Here's a small anecdote to leave you with. When a senator in 1953, JFK sent a memo to his peers soliciting contributions for a fund to help the famously frugal Russell afford to wash his car. A joke that the Georgia giant enjoyed. There's an apt metaphor here. By contrast with Russell's sincere but ungenerous notions of civil rights, Kennedy's conception of nation and modernity sought to wash from numerous social, cultural, and legal vehicles the deep and crusted grime of attitudes and codes, not just discriminatory, but also inhumane. Surely, this desire derived in part from his immigrant Irish family's belief in American opportunity. To speak a little more abstractly, irrespective of how long it took to evolve, the Kennedy social justice program in place by the time of the New Ross homecoming all but demanded that the grand vehicle of the Constitution, especially the 14th and 15th Amendments, be aligned more fully with the trajectory it itself identifies. The trajectory of inalienable rights. A phrase from 1776 so reminiscent of the formulation unalienable rights, coined a half-century later by the Scots-Irish philosopher Francis Hutchinson, a son of Saintfield, County Down. Undoubtedly, John and Robert Kennedy's earnest thought leadership and intrepid executive, judicial, and ultimately legislative initiatives were key in effecting the South and America's difficult turn onto a substantive civil rights road. A road that's still very much under construction in the United States. A road that has intersected with the streets and boreens of our country. A road that now may be reaching thoroughfares in alleys in Aleppo and Daraya, Syria. Jack Kennedy and Dick Russell, opponents, yet collaborators, even friends, from different worlds, yet equally committed to one great nation. Although the civil rights Russell is hard to embrace today, the JFK-Or-BR relationship serves as an intergenerational essay in mutual respect. Furthermore, to this student at least, it also provides an object lesson in political and personal integrity. As a once privileged civilization, let's go of the tenet that its honored past could continue whole cloth to function as its everyday present. Enlightening matters for Kennedy's beloved Ireland? I think so, and I thank you.
Sharing of your knowledge and wisdom about that period in the United States, which has been so influential and very important. I hope all our history students here are getting the idea how important history is and what we can learn from it. And now it's a great honour for me to introduce Austin Curry to you. Again, like Howard, I don't have the exact title of the speech, but I can guess what he's going to say. I'm not going to tell you what that is. But when I was growing up, I remember very well the beginning of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and Austin in particular. I've seen photographs of him on the newspapers at the time. I think sometimes between policemen, which mustn't have been the easiest thing to be doing. He was the originator of the civil rights movement. He's also unique in that he served in both the governments of Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland as ministers. He was organiser of the first civil rights march, and he also tells me he was a squatter. In America they would say sitting, I think, which sparked off the civil rights movement. At the age of 24, he was the youngest member of Parliament in the old Stormont Parliament. And he also has written an autobiography, which is called All Hell Will Break Loose. I think it's time to allow him to speak to you. And welcome, Austin Powell.
Very young man. I was 24 when I was first elected as a member of Parliament, and that was within 6 months of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And he has been an inspiration throughout my political life. He and his brother Bobby, and also his other brother Ted. I didn't personally know the elder Kennedy brothers, but I got to know Ted Kennedy quite well. And I was to pay tribute to him for the part that he played directly in relation to a solution to the Northern Ireland problem and the establishment of civil rights in that part of our island. I like to be able to see my audience, and I have some difficulty in that respect, but I do recognize that probably a considerable majority of you weren't even thought of when the events that are so fresh in my mind and in Howard's mind was happening. But we hope we can contribute to your knowledge of history on this occasion, because I'm aware of the fact that this period is on the syllabus for the Leaving Cert. And so there may be some additional interest there, and I'll try to take a different attitude, a different line to complement Howard, but not to coincide with him. It surprised some people that the civil rights movement in the United States was such a strong formative influence on the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. A political commentator has said, and I quote, "The civil rights movement took much of its inspiration, strategy and tactics from the movement in the United States. And it is a matter of some pride that a white, largely working class community in a political backwater 5,000 miles from Mississippi and Alabama identified so strongly with their black sisters and brothers in the United States. It is an interesting footnote as well that a religiously quite conservative Catholic community embraced a black Baptist preacher called after the father of the Protestant Reformation as one of its great heroes. Particularly so, I might add, when most of their cousins in Boston, the Bronx, or Chicago were anything but supporters of the black civil rights struggle in the United States. I had some personal experience of that myself at a rally in Bayside in New York at the height of the successful civil rights Northern Ireland campaign in early 1969. A very packed meeting and introduced with some fanfare, with bagpipes and the national anthem and the tricolour flying, and a very exuberant and enthusiastic audience. one of the speakers before me was someone who later became quite prominent in politics here. But at that stage was a professor, a visiting professor in the United States, in a university in New York. And in the course of his remarks, he said to the audience, if you support civil rights in Northern Ireland, then you should support civil rights in the United States. And about a quarter of the audience walked out. I followed him, and I was quite sensitive to my audience. So for a while, I dwelt on issues such as the failure of the IRA campaign that had failed in 1962. That I explained why we were committed to non-violence, that it wasn't just a pacifist approach, that we had an additional commitment to non-violence because the Unionists knew how to deal with violence, but they didn't know how to deal with non-violence, and that's one of the reasons why we should be non-violent. I emphasized the moral importance of non-violence and being able, in a non-Irish way, to turn the other cheek. And I then went on to describe what we were doing in Northern Ireland in terms of the policy of the New Departure, which, as historians will know, some historians anyway will know, the New Departure was a policy that was pursued in the 1880s and the 1890s, which was led by Parnell, which embraced the constitutional movement, the Land League, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenians, and which created a unity. Sometimes it wasn't easy to do, created a unity between Irish Americans and the Irish at home. And I dwelt on these matters in my speech, and I appeared to be getting on very well, and I was holding the audience, but then I felt it necessary to go to the theme which Conor Cruise O'Brien had previously mentioned. I said, and it is true, and I support what he has said, if you support civil rights in Ireland, you should support civil rights in this country as well. And another part of my audience was that. I still have the majority with me, but it was pretty obvious to me what a section of that Irish American support what they were thinking. And then I was told that arrangements had been made for where I was going to stay that night. An elderly gentleman, he seemed elderly to me then, told me that I was staying with him and we'd travel on the subway. And he then introduced himself on the way as a former IRA man. He had left, he'd taken the losing side in the Civil War. He had left Ireland in 1923, and he lived in the United States ever since. And he said it was very important for him to get home early because the wife was waiting up for him, and would I please join them saying the rosary before we went to bed. Well, I was more interested in the drinks. The only drink available was tea. So I had tea, said the rosary, and went to bed. That man, that gentleman, later turned out, not so much later, he turned out to be the head of NORAID, the organization of the United States which supported the provisional IRA, not only with finance, but also with guns. So that was an experience. But there were greater similarities between the movements for civil rights in the two countries than the minority at the New York rally failed or refused to recognize. In particular, the essential factor for success in most cases in most countries was the intervention of the sovereign government In the case of Northern Ireland, the sovereign government at Westminster, and in the United States, the federal government and its agencies, particularly the Supreme Court. Central to the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Campaign was the belief, based on 50 years' experience, that the Northern Ireland government would not introduce the necessary reforms unless pressurised by Westminster, and that the British government would not intervene unless it had no alternative. Creating the circumstances which would compel the Westminster government to exercise its sovereign control was the motivating force behind those who planned and organised the Civil Rights Campaign. Section 75 of the Government of Ireland Act 1920, the Constitution of Northern Ireland, made it clear where sovereignty lay. And I quote, "Notwithstanding the establishment of the Parliament of Northern Ireland or anything contained in the Act, the supreme authority of the Parliament of the United Kingdom shall remain unaffected and undiminished over all persons, matters and things in Northern Ireland and every part thereof." Despite the clarity of the Act, however, a Speaker's Convention had evolved, which ruled out the raising of any matter in Westminster which was within the responsibility of the devolved Parliament and Government of Northern Ireland. The Convention was, of course, convenient for successive British governments, which, having got rid of the troublesome Irish in 1921, didn't wish to be dragged again into the Irish political bog, but was a matter of deep frustration for the members of the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster, particularly when, in the first Wilson government, with the majority of 3, Unionist MPs persisted in putting the government's majority in peril by voting on matters which concerned Labour constituents in England, Scotland and Wales. To Irish nationalists and Republicans, a concentration on British sovereignty, as enshrined in the Government of Ireland Act, did not come easily. It reminded us of partition and sellout and humiliation. There were easier ways of rousing enthusiasm at public meetings in the Square of Island or in Crossmaglen. Nor did the central tenet of the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster, that as British citizens we were entitled to the same rights as other British citizens, that did not strike an immediate chord in the nationalist hearts of those who did not wish to be British citizens at all. I found a formula to cover my sensitivities when Jerry Fitt brought a group of Labour MPs to Killarney on a fact-finding tour in 1967. And I quote, "If we are British, and the Unionists say that we are, then I demand the same rights for my constituents in Coal Island as British citizens in Coventry. The exact same rights to the people of Belfast as for those who live in Birmingham." We had found the Achilles heel of unionism. When unionists claimed to be British, they were not prepared to embrace British standards of democracy. It was simple, but in terms of traditional nationalism, it was revolutionary. When the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was formed in 1967, it had 5 objectives. 1, to defend the basic freedom of all citizens. 2, to protect the rights of the individual. 3, to highlight all possible abuses of power. 4, to demand guarantees for freedom of speech, assembly and association. And 5, to inform the public of their lawful rights. These objectives were wide enough to cover those matters which were at the heart of the unjust system which unionists had erected since 1920. Discrimination in houses and jobs, gerrymandering of electoral boundaries, which enabled unionists to control Derry and other areas where they were in a minority, the lack of one person, one vote, and the permanent presence on the statute book of the Special Powers Act, which was the envy of the apartheid government in South Africa. But most significant of all, there was no reference, direct or indirect, to the unification of Ireland. NICRA, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, was based not on the 1916 proclamation or the programme of the First Dáil, but on the British National Council for Civil Liberties, an organisation which had been in existence for decades. In the almost 50 years of the existence of Northern Ireland, opposition to the Unionist regime had fluctuated between half-hearted constitutionalism and IRA violence. The anti-partition campaign in the post-Second World War years had attempted to harness Northern nationalists, the Southern political parties, and supporters in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere. The main IRA campaign waged between 1956 and 62 attempted to capitalise on the frustration caused by the failure of constitutional methods. The fundamental difference between these two campaigns and what was now proposed in the 60s was that the earlier campaigns were aimed at ending the partition of the country, while the civil rights campaign was aimed at inequality and injustice within Northern Ireland itself. Just as the protest of Rosa Parks against segregation on public transport provided the opportunity in Montgomery, Alabama, to publicise injustice, the allocation of a single public authority home in Caledon County, Tyrone, initiated the civil rights campaign in Northern Ireland. When it was proposed a few weeks later that a civil rights march be organised, it was specifically suggested that it should be on the United States model. But Councillor Michael McLaughlin and I proposed to the executive of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association that they give their approval and endorsement to a civil rights march. We recognised that for NICRA, their approval would represent a radical departure from existing policy. From its formation 18 months earlier, NICRA had closely followed its model in Britain, the National Council for Civil Liberties, which concentrated on the legal and constitutional rights of individuals and proceeded largely through letter writing and documentation of abuses. The proposal that it be involved in political action, similar to the United States civil rights movement, was almost revolutionary. To a select few who knew their history, there were distant echoes of the new departure, the development I've already referred to under Parnell, of a movement involving the Land League, the Irish Parliamentary Party, and elements of the Fenian movement. Let us remember how successful the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Campaign was. When I squatted in Caledon in June 1968, an action based on a sit-in in the United States, Northern Ireland had been under one-party rule for 48 years. The Unionist rule was absolute at all levels of power, political, economic, judicial. Their hegemony based on a sectarian headcount and buttressed by gerrymandering and discrimination. Neither constitutional nor violent republicanism had created the slightest dent in Unionist control, and the sovereign government at Westminster remained content to allow the devolved government to rule in its own sectarian interest. Yet, within 6 months of the beginning of the Civil Rights Campaign, nearly all of its demands had been conceded. In just over a year, the British government had been forced to intervene with its military and accompanying political presence. Within 4 years, the Stormont Parliament and government had been suspended, and within another 2 years, a government and institutions had been established through the Sunningdale Agreement, which provided the power sharing in the north and partnership between north and south. And all of this was achieved because of the initial recognition and focusing on the Achilles heel of unionism was that while unionists claimed they were British, they were not prepared to accept British standards of democracy. The civil rights success was built on the substitution of these basic human rights demands for the traditional objective of national unity, and by the substitution of non-violent means for violence, which the Unionists knew how to deal with from past experience. The new direction, the use of the head and not just the heart, created a revolution to which the Unionists had no answer. Unfortunately, this success, achieved by the non-violent action, was to be put in jeopardy by violent forces which the civil rights leadership found it impossible to control. Coming 5 years after similar developments in the United States, perhaps we in Northern Ireland ought to have learned more from the American experience. Or was the deterioration into violence inevitable? The early civil rights campaign in this country was inspired by the same idealism displayed by Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech. When we adopt it, we shall overcome. We really believed it. Young people, particularly students and recent graduates, provided the leadership in both our countries. Efforts were made to involve the other community, in the United States to involve white people, and in Northern Ireland to involve Protestants, efforts which were ultimately and disastrously unsuccessful. Media opportunities were successfully exploited, and the extremism of police and right-wing forces were exposed. Predictable confrontations were utilised with the assistance of the like of Bull Connor, George Wallace, Bill Craig, and Ian Paisley. By 1965, culminating in the Voting Rights Act in the United States, and in Northern Ireland in 1974, civil rights demands appeared to have been achieved. Political and legal equality had been gained, at least on the statute book. Unfortunately, as history ought to have taught us, theoretical freedom means little when divorced from social and economic reality. The underlying causes remain unaddressed. Poverty, bad housing, ghettos, inadequate schools, all unemployment, all of which helped to stoke the flames of sectarianism and racial hatred. The idealism of civil rights descended into black power, black Muslims, Paisleyism, IRA, and Protestant paramilitaries. In Northern Ireland, the power sharing government was brought down by a combination of intransigent unionism and extreme republicanism. And it took 25 years and 2,500 wasted lives to restore it. 25 years in which a government representative of our two traditions could have been tackling the political, social, economic, and cultural problems afflicting our people and fostering reconciliation between our two traditions. And 25 years of partnership on our island, cooperating to mutual advantage and bringing us closer together in peaceful conditions. Northern Ireland is, of course, in a much better place than it was at the beginning of the civil rights campaign 40 years ago. There are still major problems, and sectarianism in many areas is almost as bad as in the past. Unfortunately, the political deal between the DUP and Sinn Féin has elements of apartheid in terms of the original meaning of that word, of separate development. Nevertheless, the days of one-party rule are gone forever, and the power-sharing institution based on partnership within the North and between North and South are the best guarantee of a lasting settlement. And in the United States, we have a black president, and hopefully he'll be there for some time. The originators of the civil rights campaign in both of our countries would be reasonably satisfied. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Austin. It's great to listen to one of the protagonists of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland and to hear his experience, and we can learn a lot from that too. So, you know, the benefit of experience and scholarship here this morning, in both cases, of course. Now, I would like to introduce Sean Reedy. I don't know exact title, but he's an important man here in the Ross as well. And then he will introduce Bobby Kennedy during Bobby Kennedy III.
Very important ceremony to conduct, and that is to induct Robert F. Kennedy into the Irish American Hall of Fame. The Irish American Hall of Fame is a collaboration between the co-founders of Irish American magazine in New York, Neil O'Donovan and Trish Parker, and the JFK Trust in New Ross, where we honour men and women, past and present, of Irish American background who've made outstanding contribution in their lives to the society in the fields they're there. And today we recognise Robert Kennedy, Attorney General of the United States, 1961 to 1964, a fearless campaigner against organised crime and the mafia, committed to civil rights. But for someone like me, more than anything else, his inspiration and the impact he made, and to me and many like me all over the world. So to make this presentation, I'm delighted first of all that Bobby Kennedy III is here. And thank you, Bobby, for coming. I'm delighted that Minister Brendan Howlin is going to do it. In introducing Brendan Howlin, I just want to say that Brendan has been a great friend of Dunbrody going back to the 1990s. You remember, early 1990s, and I don't think Dunbrody will be there but for Brendan Howlin. I'd just like to say that here today. So could I ask Brendan to
Thanks indeed, Sean. Can I say that all of us gathered here today are truly indebted to Sean and to Noel for providing us with this extraordinary forum. I know those of us who are still at the coalface, and I see my ministerial colleague Paul Kehoe here present, are indebted for the opportunity just to step out of the immediate challenges of hard decisions, to put those decisions through the prism of history and the wonderful articulation of challenges that faced politicians and citizens in previous times. And I suppose it reinvigorates us in the challenges we have to face, I suppose an awful lot less onerous, although burdensome on on people than those that not only were met, but were overcome by people of vision in the past. But the specific task that I have been honoured to be asked to do was to recognise here in New Ross one of the most inspiring leaders of the 20th century, a man with a unique and inherent capacity to connect to millions of ordinary people in his own United States and around the world. The life of Robert Francis Kennedy continues to stand as a powerful source of inspiration. Though it's some 44 years since his untimely passing, Senator Robert Kennedy's passionate commitment to justice and equality remains as relevant now as it ever was. He was an innovative and courageous US Attorney General, an outspoken and world-renowned senator for the historic state of New York, a leading candidate for the United States presidency, and a loving father and husband. And yet he was very much more. For millions of people in the United States, in Ireland, and around the world, he was the voice of the marginalized, of the victims of war, and all who had suffered oppression and who had been denied basic human rights. A man raised in an environment of prosperity, an environment of opportunity, Robert Kennedy dedicated his life to the service of others less fortunate than himself. As he campaigned for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1968, he spoke with an urgency and a passion for a vision of a better world, an urgency and a passion rarely seen in the political sphere. As a consequence, he attracted not only the support and respect of millions, but their love, particularly of the marginalized. Perhaps it was his stirring belief in the future of hope, opportunity, and peace that has been his most enduring legacy. Paraphrasing from a George Bernard Shaw play, Robert Kennedy, like his brother before him, repeatedly appealed to his fellow citizens to have the ambition and the vision to build a better society with the words, "There are those who look at things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not." We in Ireland, particularly here in County Wexford and in the town of New Ross, are deeply proud of our close connections with the Kennedy family. Next year we look forward to the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's historic visit here. These events will once again remind us of the remarkable relationship between Ireland and the United States, a relationship embodied so powerfully in the moving Kennedy story. To the many people in the country who continue to struggle to overcome severe economic challenges, and there are many in our town here, and in our county, and across our country, and to societies around the world affected by conflict or denial of basic rights, RFK's message continues to offer hope and inspiration that better days can and will be achieved. As he famously said in a visit to South Africa in 1966, "It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of another, or strikes out against injustice, he sends a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." Robert Kennedy's memory inspires Americans and Irish people still, and I'm deeply honoured to be part of an occasion that recalls his legacy, and I'm honoured to be in the company of his grandson. Thank you indeed.
grandfather is significantly better at making off-the-cuff speeches than I am. So I'll simply accept this award and deliver it to my grandmother on behalf of her and my 11 uncles and aunts and my many, many cousins. And I'll try to bring as many of them back next year as I can. And if we get a third of them here, I think we're going to need a bigger room.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister and Bobby. And now we have, for the rest of this session, a little bit of time for some questions here with the panel of speakers. Since you're in darkness and I'm in the light, I can't exactly see. Noel Whelan is carrying the microphone, so you will be heard anyway, if not seen. I think we're getting to see some people now. So, who is the first person that would like to speak? Sorry. We're waiting for the technology to work here.
No, yes, we're on. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for 2 wonderful papers. Austin Currie has always been one of my heroes because of the stance he took in the North. A man who knew what it took to deliver civil rights in the North, and indeed to deliver the unity of Ireland, which is an aspiration for many of us, but to do it the right way. Just like to put it now, just as John F. Kennedy managed to work with Russell to deliver an eventual outcome, we have had the Good Friday Agreement, but there is no noticeable sign of anybody working the system like Kennedy and Russell did. Now, Russell mightn't have liked the outcome, but he accepted it. We have acceptance in the North, and they mightn't like it, either side. But there is no perceptible improvement, as evidenced by the outbreaks of violence recently over the last few nights, as evidenced by, for instance, commemorations of the hunger strikes in GAA facilities. The decision of the Sinn Féin Minister for Agriculture to shift the Department for Agriculture from East Belfast, the bastion of unionism, to Derry. Now, I have no objection to it whatever in doing that, ultimately. But there doesn't seem to be anybody working the cross-community situation politically, community-wise, or any otherwise, except for some small evidences. In particular, Austin, I wonder would you like to comment, is what needs to be done up there?
Well, can I be heard? I usually can be. The SDLP once had a slogan that appeared on the posters during the election campaign, and it said, "One strong voice." And I think I symbolised that to some extent myself. Nothing that I would say in response to that question should suggest that in any way I'm detracting from the importance of the Good Friday Agreement and the institutions that were established, or my firm belief that that is where the future lies in terms of partnership in the North and partnership between North and South. But I have to accept and I have to agree to acknowledge a certain disappointment in the way in which things are developing. In my speech, I referred to the growth of apartheid in terms of the original meaning of that word in South Africa, which was separate development. And unfortunately, that, I believe, is happening to a worrying extent in Northern Ireland. The DUP and Sinn Féin are, of course, involved in government. They're looking after their own interests. They're looking after their more interests more than they're looking after the general interests of the two communities in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin looks after its people, and the DUP looks after its people. And unfortunately, potential developments on the horizon could increase that failure. I refer to the proposed reorganisation of local government, where the new councils will rather institutionalise a situation where the DUP is in firm control in a number of councils, and the Sinn Féin is in firm control in certain other councils. Now, that is something, that is a development which is worrying. It's early enough yet to stop, I would hope, but people have to recognise that it is a factor and be prepared to do something about it. I mean, we're talking today about comparisons between the United States and Ireland, and the United States and Northern Ireland. And I'm not going to put forward myself as any sort of an expert on developments in the United States. But it does strike me that over the years there has been a polarisation there as well, and a concentration on separate development, which is extremely worrying. But as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, in response to the question that I was asked, yes, there are worrying factors, and as the questioner suggested, the recent rioting in East Belfast, other developments, the potential for trouble coming up to the end of this month with the commemoration of the signing of the Covenant, and other commemorations coming up over the next few years. You know, that there are weaknesses there which can be exposed. There are weaknesses which can be deliberately widened, and certainly in relation to the relationship of the two communities and the police force, that will be a matter of particular challenge in these marches which are anticipated.
I would just add, in the case of the United States, Austin, you're so right, the dynamic and the atmosphere has become so dysfunctional and embittered. And I think that is something that we can really learn from the Russell-Kennedy relationship. The degree of mutual respect, integrity, courtesy, and a larger sense of patriotism that inform that relationship, that seems to be remarkably absent in American politics today. In fact, I think it was just a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago, the congressional correspondent for National Public Radio in the United States resigned because she said that she was not really covering democracy anymore. She was covering some kind of circus, that the Congress had become so profoundly dysfunctional. And that's a pretty big statement about where America is. So despite their remarkably, they were really polarized on the issue of civil rights, Russell and Kennedy worked intimately together with incredible respect. In fact, when Johnson was pushing the civil rights bill through the Senate, he had Russell over to dinner every Sunday night. And the degree of friendship there, being able to literally break bread with your single greatest opponent in the signature issue of your presidency is an astounding statement about where we are now compared to where we were then. I'm going to say one other thing about, as having lived now in the southern United States, and we're, my kids, we live in a town where the majority of the population is African American. So 60% of the children in the school that my kids attend are African American. And in our town, we're at the cold face of a lot of that. And there are still tremendous problems, as Condoleezza Rice did say. Education, she reckons, and I agree with her, is the real civil rights challenge for the US today. But one thing that I think we can draw from the story of Richard Russell is that, and I think it applies to Northern Ireland, is that economics play a tremendous role in all of this kind of politics. If people are economically stressed, if there's endemic poverty, this really reinforces those old animosities. They become the thing that people identify with. Whereas if people are moving forward and the economic horizon is bright, there's less tendency to dwell on those other ancient animosities. And Russell, even though we might look at him and say he was very regressive, in many ways he was extraordinarily progressive. If none of you have been in Atlanta, you have come into what is the biggest airport in the world, in a city that 50 years ago was really just sort of a backwater in some ways. And it was Russell who brought the Centers for Disease Control to Atlanta, brought the Lockheed Martin plant to Atlanta, that brought such incredible economic prosperity to, and changed the South. So a lot of the change in the South is predicated not just on the moral issue, but also on the economic issue. And I think that's one of the things that in Northern Ireland, obviously with things like Invest Northern Ireland and so forth, that's important. I'm not saying it's a solution, but it is, after all, a lot of the civil rights marches in the first place were about economic issues, housing and so forth. So I think that we do need to pay attention to the economic dimension of this, and the more cooperation around economics, in my opinion, the better for this island.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more brief question.
Just as very ancient student of history, and what I think is so really exciting about this weekend and about history in general is you're always learning something new, and if we don't learn from the mistakes of history, we're going to repeat them, as Northern Ireland has shown. Ireland probably led the world by using constitutional means when O'Connor got Catholic emancipation. Parnell achieved the Land Acts. We nearly had a 32-county Home Rule Bill, but Sinn Féin couldn't wait. And if they had only gone, well, I believe, if they had only gone to Westminster and talked to those unionists. But here in Ross, one of the big images we have is our ancestors pouring down Mary Street and shaking sides at the cannon that was there at the Tholson. And we must learn from that. But I think one of the things just crossed my mind when Austin Curry was talking about the problems that still are there in the six counties. One of the things of the Irish Parliamentary Party, when you're reading about them, you had a fellow who was T.P. O'Connor. He was an MP for Liverpool, and he didn't live in Ireland. He was an MP for Irish nationalists, but he lived in Liverpool. And is there any way we could organise the Irish or the sympathetic Irish population in Britain to highlight the state of the six counties, to harness their sympathies in some way? And I also found Professor Keeley's highlighting of that Russell. We had George Russell, an Irish poet, at the turn of the last century, and to a kind of this thing that the Kennedys had. You said it's economics, but it's also meeting people, talking to them, dialogue seems to be the key. Thank you very much for this marvelous day.
Do you want to respond?
I would just say, I think we could take some words from what the Queen Elizabeth's remarks in Dublin last year. And you know, some of that speech was written by a Wexford man, and he in fact really wanted to integrate into the speech this idea that the Irish-English relationship is both at the level of nations, but also at the level of families. And I think in terms of what you're imagining about telling the story more broadly, I think that maybe is at the level that we should be looking at it, where we can relate to our brothers or sisters, our cousins in England, our story, let that story be part of our dialogue with them. So that's what would be my immediate response.
Well, there was a time, as I said in my earlier remarks, when it was essential to influence opinion in Britain, internationally, and opinion in the United States as well, in order to exert pressure on the Unionist government and then on Unionist politicians. It was absolutely essential, and I don't think the Good Friday Agreement could have been achieved without the success of that pressure, and particularly in the United States. And Ted Kennedy was extremely important in this respect, as was other people in both the Democrat and the Republican Party. Reagan, for example, though he didn't appear to be doing much at the time, his relationship with Thatcher was an important one. And so I never minimized the importance of outside influence and the necessity on occasions of utilizing it. But it appears to me that at the present time, that rather than having a priority of concentrating on influencing opinion outside Northern Ireland, it's far more important to be influencing opinion within Northern Ireland itself. And I think there's a particular job there that has to be done in relation to the Protestant community. And I was, it struck me when I watched Vox Pop on television the other evening in the aftermath of one of the riots they're having in East Belfast. And there was a Protestant from the Shankill Road area was interviewed as to why people were rioting, and he said, "What have we gained? We know what we've lost, but what have we gained from this deal? What have we gained? Have we got jobs? Have we got better housing?" And then he went on to say, "And can we walk wherever we want to walk and march wherever we want to walk?" Well, I'd have some difference with him in relation to the last part. But I do understand that if you have been given the impression over a considerable period of time, indeed longer than the existence of the state of Northern Ireland itself, that in some way you are better, that you are a top dog, that being reduced to a position of equality is something you might have difficulty in coming to terms with. And I think as far as a section of the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, and certainly a section of their political leadership, I think that is a job that we ought to concentrate somewhat on.
Good point at which we can conclude our session. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Particularly, I'd like to thank our two speakers, Howard and Austin. And I'd like to thank my colleagues from WIT for attending here as well. And particularly, I'd like to wish all the students here from the various schools in UROS the best of luck, wherever stage of studies that you're at. I hope this will be a day you'll remember, and I look forward to you all studying history, most likely in WIT in the near future. I'd just like to say as well, I'd like to thank Noel for inviting me and inviting WIT to take part in this session.